Once again, welcome. It's great to be able to conclude this series tonight that we've been doing on the topic of abiding. For those of you who have joined us for this entire series, you'd recall that I began this about 5 weeks ago. We kind of switched a couple around, but I began this 5 weeks ago and we looked at Moses' encounter with God through the burning bush. And then Rod spoke about experiencing God in the midst of hardship with Joseph in prison. Then Tim last week spoke about Jesus having a nice little sleep on a pillow during the storm and what that means for us. And tonight we're going to be concluding this series looking at the story of Gideon. Now, I don't know what kind of comes to mind when you think of Gideon. It was interesting as I was doing preparation for this message, I got a whole lot of different people with lots of different perspectives on Gideon. You know, was he as fearful as he appeared? You know, was he really timid? Was he a warrior? Was he all that God called him to be? Lots of different perspectives on Gideon. But I hope tonight we can learn from Gideon. Gideon and his actions. Whether they be right or wrong, there is something about the way that Gideon interacted with God that God chose to respond to. Okay, and this is the key. Regardless of what Gideon did, regardless of how right or wrong it was, God chose to respond, which first and foremost demonstrates that God is faithful in communicating the messages that he desires to communicate with us, even in the midst of our frailty. And so I hope that would be an encouragement that you'll take away from tonight. Now, abiding. This is something I shared the first week. Abiding can include both forms of action and inaction, but it always has intention. This is one of the things that I kind of introduced this series with, knowing that when we talk about being still for the glory of the Lord is moving in this place, there is being still as in physically still, being still in our heart, but then there's also abiding that involves being deliberate about kind of actions that we're taking and reflecting on those actions. And so abiding isn't just one or the other, it's actually both, and this is an important thing to understand. After the first message, it was actually Alex who texted me, who'd been watching online, welcome to those watching online, and was asking a bit more about this whole abiding thing, and kind of said, what do you define as abiding? Like, what do you define as abiding? And I kind of thought about it for a moment, and I texted him back this answer. I said, for me, abiding is consciously living in a state where you're being guided by God. That's what abiding is. It's like consciously living in a state where you're being guided by God, whether that be through being still, whether it be through taking action, but regardless, it's being in this conscious state. And that's what we all desire to do, right? Because as followers of Jesus, we don't just want to kind of know some stuff and then try to live it out. We want to be in the kind of relationship with God where he is prompting us and leading us and guiding us and opening up opportunities and closing doors, and where we're so kind of in tune with God, right, that we can have confidence that no matter what's occurring around us, that God is in and through and a part of it. And so that's the desire for people on mission every day. This is our desire for our families and for our workplaces and for church, of course, to be living in this constant state of hearing and responding to God, for this is what discipleship truly is. And yet in the midst of that tension, there's these questions that I know I constantly ask, and I'm sure you've asked them too, which is, how do I know it's you, God? If I feel prompted, if I feel like an opportunity opens up, the question, how do I know that it's you, God? Or is this just me? Is this me just conjuring something up? Is this me just kind of seeing something that isn't really there? Is this just my own selfish desires that is manifesting in some way that I kind of go, oh, maybe that could be God? Well, these are valid questions, and they're questions we should be asking, but part of this abiding series is looking at how we respond to that question. And I believe that tonight has something to speak to that question. God, how do I know if this is you? Now, I've heard of many Christians actually refer to this idea of putting out the fleece. Has anyone here heard of that idea? Just give me a little hands up. Just give me great, okay. So sometimes Christians use this terminology, I'm just kind of putting out the fleece, and that's what we're talking about tonight. But there are an equal number of Christians who are a little bit awkward about it, because of this great statement in the Bible that says, do not test the Lord your God. And so there's this part of you that's like, I'm putting out the fleece, just like Gideon. And there's like, do not test the Lord your God. Well, we're going to navigate that tonight. We're going to look at what Gideon did and what he didn't do, and actually discover that there is some truth here that we too can embrace. So if you've got your Bibles, feel free to navigate with me to this passage. You might have a different translation. It might pop out and God might speak to you that way. But we do have it on the screen as well. So here we go. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground around is dry, then I will know that you have saved Israel by my hand, as you said. And this is what happened, or that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. See what he did there? Switching it up. Then that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. Now, this is really interesting because sometimes Gideon can kind of come across as this kind of really kind of scared guy. Initially when he was met by the angel that he later kind of realized was God, he talked about being the smallest or the lowest in his family. It's like, what kind of authority do I have to be your leader, to be your judge? But I want to make sure that we approach this kind of fleece kind of experiment from a true picture of his posture. Because I want to be reminding us tonight that what is happening to the nation of Israel at this particular point in time is they're coming out of what's called like a scorched earth approach or to military victory. So the enemies that surrounded them, they weren't the kind of enemies, much like the Romans, who would kind of take control of the situation and then leverage, right, the people to their advantage. This was full-on destruction. We will destroy your crops. We will destroy your fields. Scorched earth policy was we will go in and we will destroy, okay? And so this is what Israel had been experiencing, this kind of scorched earth policy where everything that they had, their whole sense of identity, even their sense of God's presence with them, had essentially been kind of wiped out in their minds by this full-on approach to victory in terms of their enemies. And they had been under persecution. They had felt abandoned. And fascinatingly, even the angel or the messenger that God kind of came in the form of to Gideon didn't even reveal himself till a little bit later on. It's like he's having this chat with Gideon. He's saying, hey, you're going to be this leader. And Gideon's like, hey, why would you choose me? And they're having this interaction. And then it's only later that Gideon's like, oh my, this is God. And so you kind of wonder how shaped Gideon's perspective must have been, how hurt he must have been, how heartbroken he must have been due to his circumstances. He wouldn't even realize that this was a God speaking to him for all that time. And so this is the context where Gideon is putting out the fleece and where he's kind of testing, so to speak. This isn't like I'm in a position of power and I know that God's with me and you know what, I'm going to test God here. This is, I am broken, I am hurt, our nation is in disarray, and you're asking me to do what now? I'm going to put out the fleece. You know what, I don't think that Gideon was quite as timid as sometimes we think he might be. I want us just to jump back a little bit. This is just before the fleece. It says, now the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. These are the verses that precede the fleece thing, right? This wasn't Gideon just kind of like, oh, I'm not sure what to do, I'm just going to chuck out the fleece. This is actually the context where he's already calling the army to arms. It's like there is an opportunity, right, where his enemy is gathering together, and so the Spirit of the Lord has already come on him, and he's calling out, he's gathering all the people in preparation for war. And so in some respects, even though we can take this fleece imagery and kind of go, oh, is he just scared? Well, actually, right now, what you see is Gideon's posture is actually a readiness for war. It wasn't actually a posture of fear. And what we see him doing is actually waiting on God's timing. Waiting on God's timing. He's got everything at his disposal. It's ready to go, right? Then he lays out the fleece. And this is really important to understand because when we read in the scriptures, do not test the Lord your God, a passage that Jesus even quotes during his temptation. You see, testing can be about power, right? It can be about power. I'm going to test you to see whether or not you're capable. It can be about power, but it doesn't have to be about power. This was about direction for Gideon. I mean, let's be honest, all throughout the scriptures, we have people who are doing tests, so to speak, in order to get direction. Even when Judas committed suicide and the apostles were looking for a new apostle to join them, they cast lots. There were testing processes that occurred all throughout Scripture that weren't about, I wonder if God will come through. I wonder if God is strong enough. I wonder if I can get one up on God. But rather, it's I'm looking for direction. I'm looking for guidance. And in Gideon's case, to be perfectly honest, I think I'm looking for timing. And so this is the posture of Gideon when it comes to the fleece, not of a fearful person. I mean, don't get me wrong, he was facing war. There's always going to be some fear. But this was a guy who had already rallied the people and were ready to attack their enemies. And so let's look now, with this in mind, at exactly how this whole fleece thing occurred. It says here, Gideon said to the Lord, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, I will place a wool fleece. If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised. What I love here is actually kind of the specifics of the request. It's like, if you has detail, save Israel has detail, by my hand has another specific detail, as you have promised has another specific detail. He's actually laying out this kind of picture of the four things that he wants to see as he lays out this fleece. He gets very specific. It's like, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, this is what I'm going to do. And we actually see this happen twice in the repeat of this experiment as well. And it's very important. It's very important that when it comes to us actually seeking direction through abiding and maybe even putting something to the test, that we are specific about what we are looking for. What we are looking for. I thought it was really interesting this morning. We had this beautiful moment where we red-booked or we farewelled the Major family, and I had the privilege of journeying with them. They're not going until the 26th, but I had the privilege of journeying with them as they kind of were making this decision to move from Alice, where they've spent the last 13 years, had, 4 kids now, but they had 3 kids here, and to move down to Victoria, to Hamilton, to a place they've never been, right? Never been. To a place where there's no guarantee of work, right? And yet they felt absolutely convinced that that's where they needed to do and that's where they needed to go. And I had the privilege of journeying with them, and they shared stories about their kids, about Nairi and Alexia having visions and dreams with specific details. H, the place is going to start with H. It's going to have something to do with koalas. These things that sound really bizarre, like, independently. And yet when put together, even this whole waiting process where Nell felt like she had the word and yet she wasn't able to share it until Brett actually raised the word himself. And friends down in Victoria who knew, they felt convicted by God that they knew where they were leading this family. But again, they didn't want to say it until God convinced or spoke to Brett specifically before they actually revealed that God had said these things. Like, when you hear these kind of specific details and this kind of testing process, this isn't ambiguous. These things are like really specific. And I think this is really important when it comes to asking the question, God, is this from you? And even kind of testing things. God, I want to test whether this is from you. Get specific about what you are asking to see. Get specific about what you're asking to see. I mean, there's Gideon saying, I want to see, the dew on the wool and it not around. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a big ask, but we have a big God. We have a big God. And interestingly, know that his request wasn't that God would do all the work that Gideon had been commissioned to do, which was, of course, to destroy the army. That was the work that Gideon had been commissioned to do. It was actually more important that God was with Gideon in this act, that he was with him in the midst of the decision. And what I love about God's response is that it wasn't just in this kind of small, pithy supply. It says, when he rose early the next day, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Like, the detail in there is significant, a bowl full. It's like when God responded, he responded with clarity, he responded with generosity. God didn't skimp on the response. And so we have this image of Gideon who's ready for battle, But he wants to understand what timing is supposed to be, and so he gets specific. God, if you're going to deliver on this thing that you say, I'm going to get specific about what I want to see. So the first thing he did is he got specific, and then the second thing is he got confirmation. Gideon said to God, don't be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time switch it around. And this is a big deal because Gideon didn't want God's response to be coincidence. He didn't want it to be coincidence. And yes, Gideon was a little bit sheepish about this. Don't be angry with me. He knows that he's kind of like, maybe he's pushing it a little bit. But God responds. God's still generous. God still wants him to obey. Let's not forget this, right? Is God just going to back off and be like, oh, you're a little bit sheepish. Oh, maybe you're not up for it. Maybe the promises that I've already spoken over you, maybe when I called you a great warrior, maybe I was wrong. No, of course not. God had commissioned Gideon for this purpose. And even though Gideon was a little bit sheepish in response, he just wanted confirmation. And perhaps rightly so. Let's be honest. Are we any different? If God is calling us to do something phenomenal, is calling us to do something amazing, we would be sheepish too, right? Maybe we would push for that one more test. And I think in many respects, this is an accurate picture of what the human faith experienced for most people. And a credit to the God who knows us well enough to know that we might need some confirmation. And he is gracious in his response. God will confirm. Now, I say this with a little caveat because I know that for some people, this can be a stalling technique, right? And so it's like, I'm putting out the fleece. Oh, I get a response. Well, okay. I'll put out another fleece. And I get the response. Are we sure? Put out the fleece, put out the fleece. And they've got a sheep station happening by the time this thing's done. And so it's not confirmation anymore. We're talking about this is a stalling tactic. I actually don't want to do it. So let's not confuse the two, which I'll speak to in a moment. But getting specific about what it is that we want to see God deliver on, in order to see his affirmation. And then getting confirmation of two things that we genuinely can take away from the experience of Gideon and this very real human experience of faith and truly abiding in God. When Megs and I came to Alice Springs, we ducked in, was it 6 months before coming to Alice Springs? 6 months, I think it was. Yeah, I think it's 18 months. 18 months. I knew it was either 6 or 18 months. 18 months before coming here to Alice Springs, we came up here and we would check it out, this church. We did a little sneaky. You probably didn't even know. Most of you probably weren't even here. That's right. But we did a little sneaky. We came in for a service because we wanted to see what this place was about, and we came up under the guise that we were visiting Megan's brother, which we were doing, but we definitely were going to really kind of check, God, is this where you want us to be, right? Because we were in Melbourne at the time. We're in Crossway, big church, been established there for 6 years. Things were going really, really well, and for many of our friends, when we kind of were discussing this idea of moving somewhere different, especially someone to Alice Springs, that seemed a little bit kind of like crazy, right? At least in their mind, right? And so we wanted to test this stuff, and it's fair enough. So we went to Alice Springs and we kind of got a sense of the church. We kind of got a sense of the vibe that was going on at the time. And admittedly, I'm just going to put it out there, it was not a good time. It was not a good time. The senior pastor had been, whatever had happened to them about 2 weeks prior, okay? And so things were in a little bit of a disarray. And so for us coming, there was a bit of a kind of like, ooh, there's a couple of red flags, Just being honest, right? A couple of red flags. And so we came away loving Alice Springs, but there was a few red flags about this church. And we said to God, we said, well, you know what? That's too big of a red flag. If that flag stays red, then that's pretty much the closed door for us. But if you want us to go to Alice Springs, then you'll need to change these things. We got very specific. You need to deal with this church issue. All right? The chaos that's going on here. It was a very specific fleece. And pretty bold too, to be perfectly honest. And lo and behold, we were just kind of like doing the next 12 months, I suppose. And we hear about this thing called the pilgrimage that this church did, where basically there was this exploration around the purpose of the church. And the big thing that kind of came out the other end was this idea of everyone on mission every day, which just happened to be pretty much our core philosophy for Meeks and myself. And we just looked at that when it came out to us and we're just like, whoa. How did what we experienced 12 months ago suddenly become this? And we started to look a bit closer and we saw that red flag that was bright red at the time had turned green. And we knew that was the sign. That was the sign we got to come. I didn't have a job at that time, right? But we just knew we had to come because the fleece had been put out, right? We'd got specific and then God delivered. And so this isn't just kind of weird out there examples. These are real examples of true big decisions that I've faced, that we've faced, that no doubt you will face. There are times and places to put out the fleece, but get specific, right? And get confirmation if you feel like you need it. But this is the most important part of the fleece thing, okay? Because you can be putting out fleeces and putting out fleeces and putting out fleeces, and God can be responding. But here's the crux of it. Gideon actually followed through. And when people come up to me and they talk about the fleece thing, this thing that kind of can feel a little bit controversial, am I testing God? They go, can I do the fleece thing? I'm actually okay with people doing the fleece thing, but the thing that I say, you can do that. Feel free to get specific and get confirmation. But here's the thing, if God gives you the direction and if he gives you the confirmation, you better well follow through. You better well follow through. Because if you are putting it out to the test and testing and then you're not following through, then suddenly that test has become something very different from what Gideon was doing. Because Gideon is sitting there with his army, waiting to attack, waiting to break through, recreate history in terms of his people who had been pushed down, who had been destroyed, who had been heartbroken. He was ready to go. He put out the fleece, and then he followed through. And I love this. It just jumps a little bit ahead because there's some little history stuff, but it says here, verse 17, I love this from Gideon. Watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do, and then all who are with me blow our trumpets, and then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled, and they pursued the Midianites. When God gave direction, even in spite of the odds, and if you actually dig a little deeper into the odds of this circumstance, it was against all odds. And then God got rid of more people until there was only a little kind of cluster left. It was against all odds. Gideon followed through. And so let's not forget that this was still an act of deep faith, okay? He put out the fleece, he put it out again, but this was still an act of deep, deep faith. And so when people come to me and they ask me about some big decisions that they're making, of course we want to talk them through, and of course we want to draw from the wisdom of Scripture, and we want to draw from the wisdom of other people who have been faithful to God and their guidance. But if they're kind of like, I feel like I need this to change, then I actually encourage them. I say, you know what, part of abiding can be a bit of fleece. But if you're going to fleece, do it right. Be specific. And most importantly, follow through. Because what's the point of asking if you're not going to do anything about it? There's no point asking in the first place. As I said at the beginning, abiding can include both forms of inaction and action, but it always has intention. And when it comes to Gideon and the fleece, this is true. He's ready. He's willing. He's waiting on God's timing. And so he gets specific. Then he gets confirmation. And then he follows through because there is always intention. There is always a sense of, I am going somewhere. God, you are leading me somewhere. And the only reason I'm asking is because I trust you enough. I trust in your generosity enough. I trust in your faithfulness enough to seek after you. And if you respond in this way, I will say yes. So my prayer for all of us here and online is that when it comes to making bold decisions, when it comes to making decisions perhaps that are even against the odds, don't be afraid of the fleece, but do the fleece right. Do the fleece the way Gideon did it, with a preparedness, a specificity, a confirmation if you need it, an absolute conviction that if God says go, you will step out in obedience. That's what the majors demonstrated this morning. And that's what we can all demonstrate and be an example of in our lives. Let me pray. Jesus, we want to thank you that you are generous, and that even in those times where we're trying to discern and we're trying to work out, God, is that you? Is that your voice? That you give us so many different ways to get clarity. God, in some ways, we thank you that it's not too obvious. That it actually does require faith. And so as we step in closer, or as we get specific, God, that we actually learn about who you are. We learn what it means to step out in true faith, what it means to be dependent on you. And so, God, I want to pray for those of us here tonight. Lord, I want to pray that we would be bold. Not because we're trying to put you to the test, but because we want to demonstrate that we will be obedient if you say go. Help us to learn from Gideon. Help us to be faithful. Help us to be courageous, because God, we want to abide. Amen.